Today I'm going to be talking about a convergence that we see in a lot of our cities around new mobility services that are being deployed and the use of city space. It's a real issue for a lot of city governments because they are seeing a number of new uses of that space for which they haven't really prepared the regulatory framework. And so the things that I'll be talking about today are how to think about respacing the city for a number of new forms of mobility. I think there's a lot going on in the urban mobility space, and I think probably one of the most important trends, if also one of the most interesting trends, is how many of these things are happening at the same time. And so that means that on the part of regulators, we have to think, city authorities, public authorities, we have to think about managing multiple trends for which we're not prepared. At the same time, there's a lot of new offers, new possibilities for people to move around cities. And clearly there's a real demand for new types of movement in cities. And so it's this convergence of how do you deal with regulating public space, regulating services that provide clear benefits for individuals in a rapidly changing world. So there are specific elements like, of course, micromobility, shared bicycles, shared scooters. There's the rise of ride sourcing. There's the new type of public transport services that we're seeing deployed. And those are all interesting in their own respect. But from my perspective, it's how all of these are happening at the same time. And how do you actually use this as a moment in which we can rethink the rules of the city space for the 22nd century, not even the 21st century. I think it's a space that's been ignored for a long time. It's been seen, the curb itself on the street side is a space to store personal property, private property, cars, priced or not. But now we're seeing that's a really valuable use of city space, and access between the mobility space, which is the street, and the pedestrian space, the valuable space in the city, which is the space between the buildings and the street. That is changing. And I think the role of the curb is going to be much more dynamic in the future. It's going to be much less static. It's not just going to be a place to store things. It's going to be an interaction space. And one of the things that we have to think about is how do you actually manage that from a logistical perspective? How do you manage dynamic access to the curb? And also from, of course, a regulatory perspective, since we work for governments. I don't think it'll be terribly different in Sweden and the Nordics, in many other places that are at similar levels of development. So one thing I do see in the Nordic countries is this ease of innovation, both of course on the private sector side, but also the ease with which public authorities often can question their regulatory role and experiment with new forms of regulation. And I think that's a space where the Nordic countries have been a leader in the past and will be a leader going forward. You asked about what I think the future of urban mobility will be like. That's a really hard question, but like in any future, the future starts now, and we can project from what we see now going forward what the future might be like. What do we see now? I think we see a real realignment of how mobility practice is organized back to the individual and back to the social, so which are two not completely aligned movements, individual and the social. But I think what that means is in the future we'll have a system of mobility, an offer of mobility that allows individuals to move around in a way that is sustainable, that benefits the social objectives that we have. That is going to require a shift in the way in which we think about the prioritization that we give in public space to different uses of that space. I think one of the things that it'll mean in the future, and this is completely low-tech, it's a future in which there will be more walking built into the city, more active mobility built into the city by design. And that's, of course, something that will be much more sustainable individually and collectively. One of the things we'll also see going forward is that we have a pacing problem, that innovations are pushed out very rapidly in the private sector, and the regulatory context is slow to adapt or doesn't adapt at all. When we talk about innovation, it shouldn't just be on the technology side or on the private sector side. It also has to be on the public sector side. And one of the things we'll have to think about is a different type of regulatory framework where instead of making rules and forget about it, like we do now, where they last 10, 15 years and we reassess them after that time, we have a much more iterative, adaptable regulatory framework where after a year or two we come back and see, was this the right thing to do and can we change it? And that expectation of change has to be built in so that the certainty that comes out of the regulatory process isn't what the final regulation is, but the process whereby the regulation is created. And that's a very different form of regulatory intervention than we've seen in the past. And in that space as well, I think public authorities will have to work with the private sector much more on testing innovations and giving regulatory exemptions that are time-bound, that are threshold-based. So for a certain amount of time and at a certain level of impact, we'll try something new. But when it becomes a longer based system, or when it reaches a level of a threshold where we have to have a more formal regulatory system put in place, then we shift into that other system. So I think it's the iterative regulation and the experimental regulation which will be on the part of public authorities to help deliver this more innovative future urban mobility space. You asked about the future of mobility and where I think it's going to be going. One of the areas we also see happening already today, but much more in the future, is that a lot of decision making in the mobility space and the transport space will be increasingly made by automated decision making systems, by algorithms. And that's the case for shared scooters, it's the case with automated driving, it's the case with a lot of new mobility services that are coming online. And that's good because algorithms and code-based systems help create new efficiencies that weren't possible before. It's problematic as well because the law, the regulatory frameworks we have now are made for human-based law and for humans. And so there's a gap, a growing gap between how decisions are made in code and how we regulate that space in paper and human law. And I think going forward, that's something that we have to close. A good example is, for example, when we think about the use of the curb in different cities by different mobility services, we specify what is the regulatory intent on how to use that by putting up signs and by putting up paint. But we should be also thinking about how we put up that regulatory intent in machine-readable form, directly in a feed that can be used by operators. That is a radical shift away from the way in which we've done law and regulation in this space. But it recognizes that the way in which decision-making is going forward is going to be less and less aligned with the systems that we've had in place in the past and more aligned with machines. And we have to communicate law to machines.